Hello, everybody. I'm Judy Woodruff with the PBS NewsHour, and I'm so pleased to be here to be part of this RISE conversation. The title of this panel is Recovery and Reimagination, and we have three very distinguished panelists to discuss with us over the next half an hour where we are in education in this country, broadly speaking, coming out of this pandemic, and where we are headed after. Congressman James Clyburn is, of course, the House Majority Whip, representing the state of South Carolina, who's joining us. Arne Duncan, the former Secretary of Education, now with the Emerson Collective, and Governor Phil Bryant, who was governor of the state of Mississippi up until just last year, just a year ago. So it is really my pleasure and my honor to be here to speak with all of you. There's a lot to cover. I don't think anybody would disagree that other than our health and the state of our economy, our children's education took the biggest hit from this pandemic. So it's really important to be having these conversations that you're having today. So I just want to start with a baseline question and just ask each of you in a sentence or two to tell me what you think was the most important thing to preserve about our education system going into this pandemic. Congressman Clyburn, what was it that stood out as something that we want to keep going forward, even as we talk about what needs to be fixed?
Well, thank you very much for having me. This pandemic was very, very revealing in many, many ways, and I can't think of any way that was more revealing than in education. And I think the country was on a very good path at keeping, let's say, keeping our pursuit of a more perfect union in focus. We were on a very good path. And then this pandemic comes, and people then begin to see that there's something that we weren't paying attention to. That's this pandemic just revealed, and it was there in education. And I want to congratulate the governor. My daughter Mignon, has told me how creative you've been on things like broadband. To me, that is key to whether or not we keep our kids in school, get our kids on a continued pursuit of perfection, which we all know that we were in danger of retreating from. I think broadband, when it comes to education, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to the 21st century, is what electricity was to the 20th century.
Governor Bryant, and connectivity is something we definitely want to talk about. Governor Bryant, what about you? What do you see as something that's precious that needs to be saved in our education system?
Great teachers. I mean, think about this. I've been in a classroom on a college level, but these great teachers are so important. So you're going along, you're teaching, you're struggling. We all understand how important really good teachers are. And then this happens. So the pandemic occurs. And before you know it, maybe some children or child in your classroom is not feeling well. Their parents have COVID, or you have COVID. I had a grandchild that the teacher in the classroom had COVID. And so every one of the children had to go home. This is a pre-K program. We have to reach out to those great teachers and say, please come back and please stay. We have to look at how we go about paying these wonderful people. So even as we looked at a nation in crisis, President Reagan's report, I was just reading it just a short time ago, and he talked about how we're going to pay teachers. And it used to be like you were almost a minister. You know how I'm from the South, so we think ministers, you just feed them fried chicken every now and then, they'll keep preaching. This is a profession. Nationally board certified teachers is something we funded in Mississippi at the highest level so we could get those great teachers back in the classroom. We've got to do everything in the world that we can to keep them there, to honor them, to raise them up. And I want to thank these two gentlemen. What a remarkable panel this is. Well, other than this side of it, but they have done such a great job. Mr. Chairman, thank you for what you've done. Secretary Duncan and I worked together when I was governor and he was secretary. We can do this. We can do this. We can bring those children back to the classroom, those great teachers, and have a remarkable future for this country.
Secretary Duncan, what about you? You look at this education system, what is it that's sacred?
There's a lot I want to change, so we'll get to that maybe, but what I want to keep, I'd echo great teachers. That's the most important thing we can do, is a great teacher in every classroom, a great principal in every school. I traveled to all 50 states. I saw lots of great schools. I never saw a great school that didn't have great adults in that building. The broadband, kids have to be able to learn anything they want, anytime, anywhere. So we got to build on that. What else to keep? Keep feeding kids. I think the pandemic exposed these massive inequities, made them worse, exacerbated them. They weren't new. Seeing states like California start to feed everybody is really important. Taking care of kids' social and emotional needs, helping them deal with trauma. I'm always going to be the guy pushing for high academic standards, but the foundation of that house has to be physical, social, and emotional needs being met. And it wasn't just the academic loss and the social loss, the loss of extracurriculars, dance, drama, sports, robotics, academic decathlon, yearbook, choir, all those things that give reasons for kids to be excited about going to school every single day. Those things are not extra. They're critically important. They're essential to this enterprise.
Well, you're all already touching on it, and it's such a huge subject, but I want to hear your personal perspective, Congressman Clyburn, on what damage you saw this pandemic do to education in your state and around the country, so that we can better understand what we need to do to build.
Well, it exposed, especially in my part of the country, exactly how limited our infrastructure or definition of infrastructure has been all about. In my part of the country, you'd be surprised at how many schools are ill-equipped for students, don't have proper plumbing. It's got nothing in their labs. This, to me, the tools, I am a former teacher. I've been in my professional career teaching history in the public schools of Charleston, South Carolina, and I know how to teach. My problem was always having the materials and the equipment with which to teach. Going into rural parts of South Carolina and see kids in school every day, spend more time ducking raindrops than they spend sitting in the classroom. Infrastructure has got to be more than roads and bridges. And even water and sewage, there's got to be school construction. There's got to be broadband. We just got to have a more futuristic look at what infrastructure really is and fund it.
Pick up on that, Governor Bryant. What do you see as somebody who lived and breathed education for the 8 years as governor? Then you go out of office and you watch the last year. What did you see going on?
I worry about the isolation. Children are social. Human beings are social in nature. So we learn a lot of soft skills by interacting at school. So conflict resolution, we hope our children are learning. A great teacher saying, y'all don't do that. Let's make sure that we love each other and you're playing together on the playground as you should be. And we take that child and isolate them. We put them at home, and sometimes we put them in front of a computer screen and we say, okay, you learn your lessons there. But what about that interaction with other human beings and how important that is? Team building. I mean, you watch children on a playground, they're going to start putting a team together. If there's a soccer ball out there, it's going to happen pretty quickly. Hopefully, I remember teaching my students in Sunday school, and I would say, what happens if a student walks into a cafeteria and drops their tray and it spills all over? What happened? And they would say, well, a lot of children will laugh. I would say, I want you to go help pick that tray up. I want you to console that student, that teammate that you have in school. I want you to help them, reach out. We teach them those socialization. You can't do that when he's stuck or she's stuck in the bedroom. Look at some of these early teens and later teens that we see suicide, depression, anxiety that is occurring in our children. You remember being in the 8th grade? Could you get your heart broken pretty quickly? Could you get bullied? I mean, all those things, your emotions, and I can tell you as a young 8th grade boy, it's the height of your emotions, and we're learning how to deal with that, how to manage that, and you can't do that in isolation. And so that's what I worry about, bringing them back into the wonderful world of socialization with great coaches, great teachers, and parents' involvement there in those schools.
That's huge. And Secretary Duncan, I mean, we just heard from Governor Hutchinson, a state, Arkansas, that kept its schools open for the most part. But so much of the country did shut down. So many students were at home, as Governor Bryant said, in their bedrooms or their kitchens or wherever. What was lost?
Well, I think so much is lost. The social part, the academic part, all those things. My biggest fear, Judy, is this has been underreported in the media. There are between 2 and 2.5 million students who never made the transition to Zoom school. They just disappeared from the system.
Absolutely.
And this is not Field of Dreams where we build it, they'll come. We're going to open schools and they'll just show up. These are kids that were by definition on the margins anyway. They had challenges at home, they had challenges in the community, and they literally haven't been in school since last March. And so this has got to be not high tech. This has got to be high touch. This has to be going to houses, sitting on porches, sitting in living room tables, dining room tables, and just talking to families, finding out what happened with that disconnect and how do we re-engage those families. If we don't do that, we're going to have a lost generation of young people. And that, the long-term implications of that are pretty devastating.
And just to continue in that vein, Congressman Clyburn, I mean, we saw the inequity in our education system. It was mainly children. The children who mainly suffered were children from the lower income families, children of color, children with special needs. What has that said about our education system and the ways we need to think about working?
That's what it says. We have not invested in the infrastructure that's required. We say we want the kids back in the classroom. What kind of shape is that school building in? What kind of shape is that classroom in? Just to say I want my kids back in the school, that we do nothing to fix the HVAC systems. We do nothing to make those schools healthy. Those schools, many of them are petri dishes. That's what they are. And we know that. So we're not going to be able to do this until we prepare them to come back. I don't know about Mississippi, but I'm going to tell you in South Carolina, you'd be surprised at what the number of school buildings that aren't in shape for students to be in them, especially with this pandemic.
What about that?
Absolutely. If the bathroom is not working in your elementary school, it's really, if the air conditioner's not working in Mississippi, try to sit at that desk and learn as a child when it's 78, 90 degrees in that room. And so we've got to put funding into infrastructures. And Secretary Duncan's absolutely right. We have to bring these children back. I work with Jobs for American Graduates, JAG. And if anybody's listening, if you're not using JAG in your state, go find it. Call me. But let me tell you, about 97% of the time we intervene with that child at risk, we get them to graduate high school. We go into that school to the principal and say, tell me who's going to drop out. And let us bring our specialists in to work with that child. And so we've been almost a year that we've been unable to interact with those children at risk in these high risk areas. And so if they don't come back, if they were ready to drop out, all of a sudden they're gone for a year, how do we get them back? The Secretary's right. We're just going to have to go neighborhood by neighborhood. We're going to have to go child by child and encourage those parents. Bring your child to school. We've got a JAG program here. Let our specialists get with that child. We can save their life. We have to do this. This is not a volunteer thing. Like we may or may not. We'll lose a whole generation, which means we'll lose this nation. We have to do this. It has to be at the top of every list of every governor, of every president, of every congressman, of every senator. That's got to be done.
My question is, are the resources there to do this? Because on top of this, you have the learning loss, Secretary Duncan, the gap where, we heard Congressman Clyburn say 2.5 million children have disappeared, but in between there are all those millions of children who just lost learning volume.
So I think this is, the hope and the promise of public education is it's the great equalizer. We know far too often it actually exacerbates the divide between the haves and the have-nots. And I think what I would love to see as a country, and for me, education is the ultimate bipartisan and nonpartisan issue. There's nothing Democratic or Republican or liberal or conservative about any of this. But if we could just set some goals as a country, your goal can't be to go back to normal because normal wasn't good enough for tens of millions of kids. So how do we reinvent? I'd just like to put out a couple goals to think about. Could we try and really climb the ladder internationally in terms of access to high quality pre-K? And I got to tell you very quickly, I don't know if you remember this conversation. I remember like yesterday where we desperately wanted to give more pre-K money to the governor, to Mississippi. And we simply didn't have enough allocated from Congress to do that. And it broke my heart because kids all over the country need that. But kids in Mississippi need that as bad or worse than anybody. And the fact I couldn't do that for him, I actually tell that story often when I talk to folks that we may disagree.
Don't bring that up.
Oh, no. That was so real. And so could we set a goal as a country? And can we set a goal in terms of high school graduation rates? Can we set a goal in terms of college completion rates? And then we could have different strategies to achieve those goals. What works in Mississippi may be different than Montana, may be different than Chicago. But as a country, we fight over small strategies. We don't have big goals. And if we could unite behind that and hold everybody accountable for achieving those goals, that would be an opportunity to accelerate the pace of change going forward.
Do we have the plan in place to do what you're describing?
I'm not even
We
talking.
are in a very politically divided moment.
We are. We were talking backstage. I'm always trying to find ways to knit the country back together again. I think we all worry about our democracy. And I can't think of a better place to try and do that than get more kids access to pre-K, to raise graduation rates, to have more young people from graduating from college. I don't know what's politically untenable about any of that. And again, that's the goals. Let's have fierce debate about the best strategies to achieve them, and things work, best at the local level. But why can't we unite behind those goals as a country?
Congressman Clyburn, is there the will? Is there the sense of unanimity among members of different parties in Congress?
Well, the short answer is no. Look, I wish we would spend half the time studying the cost of not doing something as we spend arguing over how much it costs to do it. We determine permanency in the state budget by 10-year projections, and we'll go to OMB and say, how much is this going to cost out over the next 10 years? I have never heard the discussion of how much this is going to cost us if we don't do it. I've never heard that discussion. Everything that says we can't afford it because it's going to cost us, we can't afford it. And I says, well, what is it going to cost? If you got 7th and 8th graders, and I used to teach 8th graders. An 8th grader drops out of school or loses 2 years of school, and some of them will. That is a statistic on the wrong side of the ledger. And you don't calculate that cost. We always say, well, how much it's going to cost for this kid to get books, to stay in school. And we never focus on how much it's going to cost if that kid doesn't get the books and doesn't stay in school. That's the problem.
Governor Bryant, how do you build a consensus to support the kinds of things that each one of you is talking about?
I think it takes leadership at the very top. As I said, every governor wanted to be the education governor. Well, that takes work. It just doesn't take just making speeches. You've got to go to your appropriators and say, I need funding. I've got to have funding. But we actually looked at 3rd grade reading as opposed to the number of people that would not go into prison. Yeah, if you can read in the 3rd grade and you can do math and science in the 7th grade, you're much less likely to end up in prison. Have y'all seen the cost of prisons? We put in criminal justice reform, and I saved $40 million in the first 3 years. Criminal justice reform, I said there are people who need to be in jail, and then there's people we're just mad at. So maybe the people we're mad at, they don't need to be in jail. And we save $40 million. Put that in the classroom. Yeah, there's ways that we can do things smarter and be able to put that money in the class if you have the will. But you're absolutely right. This has got to be a bipartisan. There's not one person out there that should not be held accountable if they don't put these children in these classrooms first. And you can give me all excuses, and I heard them. And I heard a lot of them from my party. Oh, we just can't do this. Oh, we've never, all the money, we'll never see any effect out of it. When I came into office, our 3rd graders, about 50% of them reading on the 3rd grade level. Last year, our 4th graders led the nation in reading growth from Mississippi. We led the nation. This can be done. Now, we had to hire 100 reading teachers. We had to get board certified teachers in. I had to bring JAG in, but that's okay. I was blessed to be able to do that. And a lot of folks moaned and complained and whined. It's costing too much money. But let me tell you, now that we're leading the nation, now our prison population is going down, now that we've got a better workforce, the road to success leads through the schoolhouse door.
how much of this, Congressman Clyburn, that we're talking about is the federal responsibility? Because we know education is at the local level, it's run by the states. But what's the separation between the federal responsibility to get our education system back to the peak that we want it to be versus what's the responsibility of states?
I don't know if I could quantify it, as to the part, separate state responsibility from the federal responsibility. I do know that our traditional notions about local control of schools and that sort of thing, I think they're being challenged in the world that we live in today. And it's time for us to, I think, take a hard look at how we supplement each other rather than worried about whose jurisdiction stops where or starts where. And we need to stop arguing over whether or not we should have a Department of Education and recognize the fact that we got to have a Department of Education. There has to be a national standard for these schools. We just cannot have 50 sets of standards in a world that every child has got to compete globally. And we need not leave that up to the responsibility of what may be short-sightedness of one governor.
How do you see that, Secretary Duncan, the federal versus state, local, and I mean, particularly with regard to something, as you said, like quality pre-K?
Well, at the end of the day, we all have a role to play, and we can sort of argue at the margins about whose role is what. But at the federal level, I think fighting for equity, fighting for excellence, funding some innovation. The idea of 50 states having 50 standards makes no sense whatsoever. We're in a globally competitive marketplace, as Chairman Clyburn said, and we need to keep good jobs in our communities and our country. I think a voice that we need to hear more from is the business community. We need the business community demanding more from all of us and holding us accountable in education. For me, we need the investment, but we need to be accountable for results. It's never about a free lunch. And so having local, state, federal stop fight, get out of the silos, help each other, invest, hold folks accountable. But if you had mayors, if you had governors, if you had congressmen, if you had senators, if you had presidents who kept their job based upon raising high school graduation rates or raising third grade reading scores, that's a big deal. And if that doesn't happen, they lose their jobs. That's what I would love to see happen.
And would that, Governor Bryant, would what Secretary Duncan's describing, would that address the need for connectivity, the broadband needs that Congressman?
We were looking at energy a few years ago. We love to say all of the above. We need all of the above. We need parents involved. I'm excited now to see parents going to school board meetings. I'm not sure the school board's excited about it, but parents have to get involved. That's where education begins. But certainly we seek help from the federal government. Let a grant show up and see who's going to turn it down. Yeah. Absolutely. But all working together from each political party, Congress working with governors, working with legislators, working with mayors, superintendents. When I came in office, we elected more superintendents in Mississippi than elected half of the elected superintendents. We did away with that. It's not good to have to be in politics and be a superintendent. It just works a lot better if you've got an elected school board and they select the most qualified. We had a lot of superintendents got elected. Most of them were called coach. Yeah, because they coach everybody's kid in the district, Mr. Chairman, and they would get elected. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but demand that quality and look to our federal partners, that collaboration with the federal government to help the states and the local districts do that. We've got to quit saying you shouldn't be here. It's my ball and I'm going to be the guy that decides what the rules are going to be. The rule is these children have to do better or we're going to find somebody else to replace you that would make sure that they are doing better.
The other question I want to have in the time we have left that I want to bring up with all of you is in this past year, it's not just been the pandemic, but we've had the racial reckoning in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd. We've had, our country's been rocked in many ways, and it's affected our education system. There's now a big argument about how children should be taught about our democracy, about teaching civic education, about how to teach American history and what to teach. How do we make sure, Congressman Clyburn, that children are learning the entire story of America in a way that strengthens our democracy, and that makes sure that every child grows up knowing the responsibility that he or she has as a citizen of this country?
Well, I think children have to understand how they fit in the overall scheme of things. When I taught school, all of my fellow teachers thought I was going to get fired because I didn't use the textbooks to teach. I used the newspapers and the evening news to teach, and the textbook was my reference book. What does it look like you teaching about the Fertile Crescent? Because I was in the classroom at the time of the Cuban crisis. Now, you think I can keep students' attention going from chapter 1 to chapter 2 when all they're seeing on the evening news and they're looking in the newspapers and they see Russia putting missiles in Cuba? I think we got to allow more creativity in these classrooms. We got to unleash teachers to imagine what can be rather than regurgitating what was. And that is a problem. And teachers are getting afraid to teach anymore. I guarantee you that if I were in a classroom today, I would probably be fired because there's nowhere in the world I'm going to be looking at chapter 1 when what's in the head news is over there in chapter 20. I just couldn't do that to students. And so I think that the politics and all this other crazy stuff, we got to take that stuff out of the classroom. That stuff has no place in the classroom. These master's theses studies that we are now accusing people of having in the second grade, that stuff is not taking place, and we ought to stop that. And so critical thinking, my goodness, you got to be able to unleash this stuff, but you don't teach second graders critical thinking. You just don't.
Governor Bryant, what about this? I mean, how do you make sure that children are learning what they need to learn in this deeply polarized environment when a lot of people want to reach down into the schools and say, do this or don't do that?
Well, exactly what the chairman said. Let's get politics out of the classroom. Let's just tell the politicians that's just not going to happen. Let's look at a curriculum. So curriculums either when I was a teacher, we got a textbook and you got tests to go along with it. You got study guides, and let's put those online so parents can see them. I ought to be able to go to my elementary school if there are my middle school and say, oh, here's what the curriculum looked like in the civics class. And yes, that's great. We have to teach, as you said it exactly, Judy, not only the rights as an American. We have so many wonderful rights. Where did they come from? We would believe they were ordained by God. So that's a good place to start by, oh, by the way, did y'all know that, students? And then you got to tell them what those 10 amendments look like and the other 17, 11 through 27 after that, and how they work and how the states do it. First thing you've got to teach them, too, is they're the sovereigns. And we in public life are the servants. That's why they call us public servants. They might not know that the founding fathers inverted the pyramid of power. You are the sovereigns. You run this nation. You run this state. You run this school district. So exercise that right, but you also have a responsibility. We want you to vote. About 35% of the eligible voters in America today even vote, 35%. In a school board district, it's less than 8. In many areas, less than 8% of the people are electing their school board. They have a responsibility. Remember when you used to get good citizenship awards? The chairman may remember it. Even in school, you'd get a little good citizenship. So you are a good. What does that look like now? You go into these schools and teach these children to be good citizens and the opportunity they have. President Reagan always spoke about that shining city on a hill. They need to hear that story again because America is indeed today still that shining city on a hill.
Secretary Duncan, you get the last word. How do we make sure that our children learn the whole story of American history and they learn their responsibility as citizens?
I'll say two things. I just think, our history is amazing and our history is heartbreaking. And our reality today is amazing. Our reality is heartbreaking. And to not talk about all of that, to not talk about race and racism and, 400 years of systemic oppression. And I want to be clear, this is not just for Black kids or brown kids to hear, it's for my kids to hear, it's for everybody's kids to hear it. And that doesn't deny the greatness of America and where we're trying to go, but to shy from those brutal truths, those hard truths, does our kids no favors whatsoever. where I think education's fundamentally changed, Judy, is, we all probably spend a lot of time memorizing things. We got Google for that and looking stuff up. But what do kids need to know now? They need to know how to think. They need to know how to express their ideas verbally and on paper. They need to be able to solve problems in diverse teams, locally, internationally. And I always think the nature of work is solving problems. And last time I checked, there's no shortage of problems to solve today. But the divide in our country would be those with the skills and ability to solve problems and those who are locked out. And I worry about the kids who are locked out of those jobs that won't enable them to solve problems. And those are the skill sets, again, nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with ideology. Every kid has to be able to think, to write, to express themselves, to solve problems, to work in teams. And if they can do that, they're going to be fine. If not, they're going to be on the outside looking in. And that's a threat to our democracy.
And just leaving everybody with this question or thought, how confident are you that this next generation is going to be able to fix the problems we're leaving them? Congressman Clyburn.
If you had asked me that question a year ago, I would say very confident. Today, I'll have to be honest with you. I'm a bit ambivalent about the future of education and the future of the country, quite frankly. You said everybody got to be able to vote. You can't say that to 48 states are now restricting the right to vote. These problems are here and they are going to be with us. And I happen to be one to remember when my parents got the unfettered right to vote.
Well, absolutely right. The responsibility that we see in this generation could be challenged, but I was raised in the 60s. I'm sorry. I was raised in the 60s, and I remember my dad, who was a World War II veteran, said, "Oh, this country's in trouble." Think about our generation when we were raised, and I always believe in the future. There are no bad kids. These kids don't show up in kindergarten as bad. And it's our responsibility to give them everything that we can to make them good citizens, good people, and successful in life. And if we don't, it's our failure, not theirs.
Secretary Duncan.
My hope is that there are so many lessons coming out of the pandemic. My hope is that our kids understand how interdependent we are, that if my family's healthy and our neighbors are sick, none of us are safe, or vice versa. I hope our kids understand the importance of science. I hope our kids understand the importance of democracy and will not just participate, but fight voter suppression, fight for the right to vote, that they have to participate. So they have gone through a once in a century trial by fire. And my hope is that many young people understand their obligation, their opportunity to make a big difference. And so I am hopeful about where we can go.
It's a good note to end on. Thank you all. Congressman Clyburn, Secretary Duncan, Governor Bryant, thank you all very much.